Hello guys, I hope all is well. If you don't already know me, I'm Matthew, and today I'm going to be showing you guys 3 ways how to exposure blend. So the first method I'm going to be using is pretty outdated, I would say. It used to be super popular and it's called HDR. It's a built-in feature within Lightroom that allows you to merge images, and what it does is it basically averages out the exposures between them. It may sound great at first, but it does have its drawbacks and we'll get into that later. Now the second method I will be using is gradient masking. This is a process in Photoshop which is basically you take however many images you bracketed, you put them in Photoshop, and you mask them using the gradient tool. So basically what it does is it takes one part of the image and it puts it onto the image below on a lower layer. And the third method we'll be using is luminosity masking. This is my personal favorite because it allows total control of the entire process, and you can really go into detail with what areas you want to mask in and what areas you want to mask out. So without further ado, let's get right into it, guys. Alright guys, so we're now back at the workstation and we got Lightroom open and we're ready to get started. So let's dive in. Okay guys, so we're now in Lightroom and we have our 3 source files. We have one exposure compensating for the highlights, we have one for the midtones, and we have one for the shadows. So our first method is actually going to be done in Lightroom, and it's called HDR. For those of you who don't know, HDR stands for High Dynamic Range, and basically what it's going to do is it's going to take these 3 images and merge them, and it's basically going to average out the tonality between them, and you're going to get a flat, low contrast image, but it will retain all the detail in the highlights and the shadows so you can edit it further. Now personally, I don't use this method because it has a lot of problems with ghosting. And what that is if you have something moving in between shots, so like let's say this first shot was completely still, which it's not, but the second shot the clouds moved. When it tries to overlay these images onto each other and average out the exposure between them, you're going to get ghosting in the sky. Let me show you. So to make an HDR, what we're going to do is click the first image, hold Shift or Command, I don't know what's on PC or on Mac, but on PC you hold Shift, click the last image, and it'll select all 3 of them. Now we're going to right click, it doesn't matter, you can right click on any of these images, then you're going to go to Photo Merge and HDR, and it's going to build you a preview of what the image is going to look like. So as you can see right now the sky kind of looks blown out and we have pretty muddy shadows, but the main problem is artifacting in the sky. As you can see, we did have clouds moving in between frames, so it kind of overlaid them and it looks kind of weird. And this is really something, if we were to go with it, would be really difficult to remove in Photoshop, but I'm going to show you anyways. But before we do that, over here we have our deghosting panel. So you can put a low amount of deghosting. It's building a preview right now. You can put a medium and a high, but it really doesn't work most of the time. It gives you really weird looking muddy images, so we're going to just leave it at none for demonstration purposes. So we're going to click merge, and depending on how much processing power your computer has, this may take a while. So as you can see, we now have our merged exposure, and if we zoom in, you can really see how funky this looks. We have kind of a haloing effect on this upper cloud, and you can see the lighting doesn't match between them, and it just looks really weird, and you can tell Lightroom didn't do the best of job merging this image. But you can go over to the sliders over here, and if you turn down the highlights, you can see we've retained all the detail in the sky. And if we go over to the shadows, we've retained all the details in the shadows. So that's one method of how to stack your images into a single exposure. Now, if you want more control over your images, you're going to have to head over into Photoshop. This second method of exposure blending is called gradient masking, and it's not perfect. I use it for about 10% of my images, and I'll show you why in a second. So let's do the same thing with the selection of the images. Just hold Shift and select all your images, and then we're going to go to Edit, in, and then we're going to go over to Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. So as you can see, we're now in Photoshop and we have all of our images. And you may be wondering why they're not all under one file stacked as layers. Well, when you open as smart objects from Lightroom, it just puts them on different layers. You're going to have to manually align them. I'll show you how to do that in a second. But anyways, the reason we chose smart objects is because we don't want to be destructive with our editing. What that means is when you edit non-destructively, you're not actually changing any data in the original file. So if we go back to Lightroom, we're going to be stacking these images. And basically what we're going to be doing is replacing the sky. So we're going to take the sky from this image and put it on this image. But you wouldn't want to do that to a source file because then you wouldn't be able to access the original file and re-edit it the way you want to. So if we go back to Photoshop, what we're going to do to move these all into one file is we're going to hold Control, left click, and then drag the image up to the first file, slide it back down, and let go. And see, it drops the image as a layer here. But as you can see, it's not aligned, but we'll get to that in a second. So once you've moved it, you can just exit it out. You don't have to save it. And then we're just going to repeat for this file. Control, left click, hold it until it highlights the file, come back down, let go, same time. And we're just going to close that out. No, we don't want to save it. So basically the way I tend to do this is I like to put the darkest file on top. So this is the bottom. That's the bottom file, I think. Yeah. So we're just going to drag that up. And we have our second darkest under that and our lightest under that. So the way we're going to align these is we're going to hit transform and we're going to manually move them. So this one seems to be, the first one seems to be framed up perfectly actually. So it's the second file and the third file we have to move. So we're going to make sure this, don't do that. We're going to make sure this is a highlighted. Second file, we're going to hold Control or Command T. And as you can see, it's selected this image. And we're going to align these to the best of our ability. So we're just going to deselect it. And as you can see, we haven't perfectly aligned it. So we're going to make sure it's highlighted again and click Control or Command T. And then we're going to go to the arrow keys and we're going to just click it very slightly until it's fully aligned. And if you want to zoom out, just hold Alt and then scroll. So if we deselect that image, we can see it's lined up pretty well. So now we can turn that visibility of that image off and align our last layer. So again, we're going to make sure it's highlighted under the Layers tab. Hold Control or Command T, and we're going to just line it up to the best of our ability. And we're just going to deselect to see if we did a good job. Oops. Hold Command Z if you mess something up. So we're just going to deselect it, and as you can see, we have the same problem. So we're just going to zoom in, hold Command T, and just slide it down until that white border is gone. So once we're done with that, actually, yeah, it looks pretty aligned. I think that's just a bug with Photoshop where it kind of shows that it's not aligned, but it really is. So we're just going to turn all those layers on, and for this first layer, we're going to click on it. And what we're going to do is go to the Add Layer, oops. And what we're going to do is go to the Add Layer Mask icon. So this is going to allow you to mask certain parts of the image onto other images. So to do that, we're going to be using the gradient tool. So the gradient tool is over here. So we're just going to make sure this layer mask is selected, and then we're going to go from the bottom up. So as you can see, the image isn't perfectly aligned. We actually have some ghosting. So what we're going to do is select the image, hold Control or Command T, and just slide it to wherever it lines up. We might have to zoom in to do this. This is kind of articulate. Whoops. Control or Command T again. make sure it's selected. I don't think it's selected. Okay, it is selected. Control or Command T. I don't know what Photoshop is doing right now. So right now we've come into our first problem, and it's not a big deal. This second exposure right here seems to be differently framed than the other two. I think when I was taking these pictures, the camera kind of moved a little bit. So what we're going to do is delete this layer mask and delete the second image. So as you can see, it is way off alignment. We didn't do it to the best of our ability the first time, so we're going to go Control T. Just kind of scoot it over, and then we're going to deselect it. Command D. So we're going to deselect it, and there is still some unlined up portions on the bottom, so we're going to click Command T. This is very repetitive, so just bear with me. As you can see at the top, got a little bit left, and there we go. It's about time. So we're going to go back to the layer mask icon and add a layer mask to this image, the top image. And then we're going to go to the gradient tool and slide from top to bottom. Now you may want to play around with this a little bit until you get it right. So I'm going to time lapse this until I get it just right. So I'll see you on the other side. Okay, so I think this looks decent. It's not the best job. You can kind of see there's a gradation right here from light to dark, but it'll do for the time being. As you can see, these branches right here, they aren't really lined up, but that's because this exposure right here is way too dark, or light. So when we have a really bright exposure and you have really narrow objects like branches, you get this haloing effect where the light it's so overpowering that it just kind of deletes portions of the tree. So if you go back to this image, you can see we have a lot more detail in the branches, but if you go back down to this exposure, a lot of that detail is just gone. So this is the downside to this image, or this way of exposure blending. Also, the image isn't perfectly lined up, so that would kind of help, but it wouldn't change the fact that there's detail missing in those trees. So the only time I would ever use this is if I had a really defined horizon, but there, as you can see, is objects, these trees, sticking up into the sky. So that adds a little bit more complexity to the process. So this is a perfectly fine method to use if you're shooting seascapes. Let's say you're shooting the ocean and you have a defined horizon line, or you're just in a really flat area. This is the perfect way to blend two photos and get the best detail out of your bracketed shots. Okay, so now we're back in Lightroom, and we still have our three images here in our really crappy HDR, but we're not going to worry about that. So we're just going to, again, hold down Shift or whatever's on Mac, select the first image, go over to the last image, select it again, and we're going to do the same process. Edit in, open as Smart Object in Photoshop. Again, we have our three layers up here, and we're just going to do the same process we did in the last method. So if you don't remember, it's Control, left click, drag, and then drag back down and let go. Then get rid of these images. Then you're going to do the same thing. Control or Command, whatever. Left click, drag, drop. And we're just going to delete that. And I'm going to line these images up. This might take a while, so I'm just going to time lapse it. Okay, so now all of our images are lined up and we're good to go. Well, they're lined up as far as I know. We'll see about that in a second. So now that they're all lined up, I failed to mention before that to do this method, luminosity masking, you are going to need the TK7 V6 panel, more specifically the Rapid Mask panel. This is a third-party plugin you can buy for Photoshop. So if you're really into photography or landscapes or whatever you do, you can get this panel, and it does a lot more than luminosity mask. It does a bunch of other things that I have no clue about. I just got it for the luminosity masking, since I am a landscape photographer. So for this first image, before we do that, let's put our darkest exposure on top. Kind of a rookie mistake. Now, before I proceed, I just want to say that my microphone just malfunctioned. So if the audio sounds any different, I'm sorry in advance. So, where were we? Now that we left off, we were stacking our exposures. We've already lined up our images pretty well. So from here, what we're going to do is click the first image, and we're going to turn the visibility off. Then we're going to go down to the TK7 Rapid Mask panel, and we're going to select Layer Mask mode. And that's going to put a white mask on this layer. From here, we're going to click Composite. And basically what that's going to do is take the sky or the highlights from the first layer and overlay them onto the second layer. So if we turn that back on, we can see it did a pretty bad job. But that's no worry, because what we're going to do is we're going to select the layer mask, click B for brush, pretty tiny brush. So let's just expand that a little bit. So as you can see in this layer mask up here, it's not fully masked out. So there's still gonna be a little bit of ghosting and motion blur in here. So we're gonna want to get rid of all of that. So we're gonna click a white paintbrush, or if you don't have the TK panel, you can go over here and make sure your fill is white. And to toggle these two between black and white, just press X. Now, a rule of thumb I like to use is black conceals and white reveals. So we're going to be using white because we want to reveal the layer below. So we're just going to start painting. And you're going to want to take your time with this, especially with these really fine edges. If you zoom in, you're going to want to be careful because you don't want haloing or weird funky exposures on the edges. So just be really careful. I think we can get a little bit bigger brush going here, so let's just make sure this is all completely masked out. And let's just make a very short pass over these trees because I don't want them to be too dark. So as you can see, it's already working wonders. And just for demonstration purposes, I'm not going to go huge into detail. But I think it actually looks pretty good at the moment, yeah. As you can see, we've retained pretty good detail in the trees over here, because between the second and third layer, there's not a lot of detail in the branches, like I said with the gradient mask example. So from here, actually wait, let me just darken that down a little bit. No, let me lighten it up, because you know it's a little bit too dark. So I think we can get away with that. Maybe make a smaller brush. Okay, that's too much. So let's just turn the opacity down. Just kind of brush over that. And let's change to a black brush and just kind of lighten up these trees a little bit. Kind of looks a little bit funky when you zoom out. So yeah, it's kind of really tedious process. A lot of back and forth. So there we go. I think that looks good. Still a little bit black in my opinion, but once we get it back in the Lightroom, I'm sure we can bring back some of that shadow detail without it looking too bad. So we're going to turn off this layer now, and the bottom layer, or the second layer, and we're going to repeat. We're going to composite it, and it's going to do the same thing that it did to the first layer. Now we're going to turn this layer back on, and we're going to select the mask and click the brush tool, B key, for those of you who don't know. I'm going to get a bigger brush going here. So this time we're going to mask out the lighter exposure from the foreground. Or, is that correct? We're going to mask the darker exposure out of the foreground because it's really hasn't merged well here. So we're just going to use the white brush, and we're just going to start to darken the foreground a little bit until it starts to look right. So I'll just speed this process up for you guys so you don't have to watch me brush in another exposure. So as you can see, this image looks pretty good in my opinion. And honestly, I think it's ready to go back into Lightroom. Just let me make some final checks here. Whoops, didn't want to do that. Oh boy, what did I just do? Let me just get the brush back again. I accidentally undid one of my previous adjustments. That was way too much. Just keep on turning the opacity down a little bit. There we go. Okay, now it's ready to go back into Lightroom. So, to save it, generally when I stack these images, what I'll do is, if I decide I want to print it, I'll save it as a PSD file. I'll save the original edits as a PSD file just in case I want to come back and make any changes to the masking, just in case there was any errors in, let's say, these trees over here. Since I did mask in a lighter exposure, there would have been detail lost in these branches. So what I would have done is come back and made that adjustment here in these original edits. So after I did that, I would click File and just save. Not save as, save. And that would save the file directly back into Lightroom. And from there, I would make my final edits. So just click File, Save. And if we go back to Lightroom, you can see here is our file. And it's ready to be cropped, adjustments ready to be made, the final edits, color adjustments, contrast adjustments, exposure adjustments. And from here, it's pretty much a not bumpy road, smooth ride, let's just say that. So I've already actually edited this image. So let me just show you what the final product is. So this is what the final image turned out to look like. In my opinion, I'm pretty happy with it. Actually, let me just turn these off. That's what the final image looked like. This is a print file. So these two layers up here are just adjustments for the printer. When I go to print, it doesn't come out exactly like you see it. There's actually a lot of different things you have to do before you actually print it. I'll go into a little bit of detail. So when you go to File and then Print, give it a second, it's gonna soft proof the image. So what that means is it's going to show you what it thinks the image will look like when it's printed. So if I turn that off, that's the actual colors of the image. If I turn this on, that's what it looks like for the specific medium I'm printing on. There's a whole different bunch of papers you can print on, but I have chosen a Baryta semi-gloss paper. So that kind of flattens out the colors a little bit, and it kind of darkens the image down. So in order to get accurate color reproduction in print, you have to get an ICC profile. And an ICC profile is basically like a translator. So let's say you wanted to talk to a Chinese dude, but you didn't know any Chinese. You'd get a translator. This is the same kind of thing. These images are shot and edited in, I think it's the sRGB color space, and I later convert them into Adobe 1998 RGB color space, or 1998 Adobe, whatever it's called. And you're trying to convert that color space into the colors in your printer's tanks. So the printer I have is the Canon Pro 300, and it's a 9-ink system. So basically, you're converting, I don't know, like 16,000 colors in Adobe 1998 color space to 9. So you really need to get a good ICC profile. I just use Canon's default because personally I find it gets closest to closest color accuracy the first time. And when I say that, I mean the color accuracy is horrendous. So that's why you got to adjust it with these curves layers and these adjustment layers to get the color spot on and the exposure spot on. But an ICC profile will really help, and most of the time an ICC profile should be enough. But in my case, and for this image, adjustments still have to be made. So yeah, that's pretty much the process. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you guys took something away from it and learned something. I'll see you later.